The moon hung low over Wonderland, its pale light spilling across the once vibrant landscape like a dying ember. What had once been a realm of boundless imagination, a world teeming with color, laughter, and nonsensical joy, was now twisted into something unrecognizable. The trees stood gnarled and lifeless, their branches clawing at the sky. Rivers ran thick with something darker than water, something that pulsed and churned as though alive. The air, once filled with melodies of talking flowers and the chatter of peculiar creatures, was suffocated by silence, an absence so profound it felt like a warning. Alice had been gone for years, returned to her world, leaving Wonderland to its own devices. But Wonderland was not a place that could thrive on its own. It had always been a reflection of the minds that entered it, a dreamscape shaped by the imagination of those who wandered its paths. Without Alice, without the presence of an active dreamer, the world had begun to unravel. And then, something else had taken root. Something that did not belong. The first signs of the fall came slowly. The white rabbit stopped keeping time. His beloved pocket watch, once the very symbol of urgency, ticked slower and slower until it no longer moved at all. He stood in place, unblinking, his eyes clouded with something distant and empty. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply stood, as though waiting for something inevitable. The Mad Hatter's tea parties grew darker, his laughter strained and hollow. The teacups no longer held tea but something viscous, something red that clung to the porcelain. The March Hare spoke in whispers, his voice frantic, his ears twitching at things unseen. The Dormouse never woke again. The Cheshire Cat, once a mischievous guide through Wonderland's nonsense, became something else entirely. His grin, which had once been a beacon of unsettling amusement, now lingered long after his body disappeared, stretching unnaturally wide in the darkness. His voice slithered through the air, warped and distorted. "Something else is here," he had murmured once before vanishing into the black, his eyes the last thing to fade. "Something that does not dream." The Queen of Hearts still ruled, but her voice had changed. It had become a whisper that slithered through the hallways of her castle, her commands no longer shrieks of rage but something colder, something calculated. The cards that once scurried at her command stood motionless, their bodies stiff, their painted faces cracked like porcelain dolls. And then, one by one, the Wonderlanders began to disappear. No one saw them go. No one heard them scream. They simply ceased to be. The flowers, once full of gossip and song, fell silent, their petals withering into brittle husks. The caterpillar, wise and slow-spoken, had curled into himself and crumbled into dust. The Tweedle twins were last seen staring at each other, unblinking, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles had turned white. And then they, too, were gone. The sky darkened. Not like nightfall, not the natural descent of the sun, but something heavier. A void creeping across the heavens, swallowing light. Wonderland was not just dying, it was being consumed. And then Alice returned. She did not know what had drawn her back. Perhaps it was an unease she had felt in the waking world, a whisper in her dreams, a pull she could not ignore. She stepped through the looking glass, expecting to find Wonderland as she had left it, mad and beautiful and utterly nonsensical. Instead, she found a graveyard. The moment her feet touched the cold, cracked ground, she felt it, an emptiness that coiled around her bones, that gnawed at the edges of her mind. The colors had bled away, leaving behind a landscape of muted grays and blacks. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen, something that pressed against her skin like an invisible weight. She called out, but no voices answered. The White Rabbit's burrow was abandoned, his little furniture overturned, his walls clawed at as if something had tried to dig its way out rather than in. The Mad Hatter's table sat in eerie stillness, the teacups shattered, the chairs knocked over as if their occupants had fled mid-conversation. The Queen's castle stood silent, the grand doors yawning open into darkness. Then she saw the first sign of life. A single playing card lay face down on the cold marble floor of the castle. Trembling, Alice reached down and flipped it over. The face of the King of Hearts was missing. Not scratched out, not erased, simply gone. A blank space where his portrait should have been. And then the whispering began. It slithered through the air, soft at first, a susurration at the edge of hearing. Then it grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in tongues she did not understand. They did not come from a single direction. They came from everywhere. Alice turned, her breath quickening. The darkness at the edges of the castle walls began to shift. It was not the absence of light. It was something else. Something alive. It stretched and pulsed, tendrils of shadow creeping forward, coiling around the pillars, slithering toward her. Then she saw them. Figures stood just beyond the reach of the dim light. Familiar shapes. The Mad Hatter. The March Hare. The Queen. The White Rabbit. They stood motionless, their faces obscured, their bodies wrong. Stretched. Distorted. Their limbs too long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their eyes, where were their eyes? A hand, too long, too thin, reached for her. Alice ran. Through the empty halls, past the silent throne, down the endless corridors that twisted and shifted as though the castle itself had become part of the nightmare. The whispers followed, growing louder, shifting into something almost recognizable. Not words. Laughter. She burst through the castle doors, gasping for breath, but the landscape had changed. The path she had taken was gone. The Wonderland she had known no longer existed. And the sky, oh, the sky. The void had spread. A single grin floated in the darkness above her, stretching wider and wider until it swallowed the last of the light. Then there was nothing.